My name is Clara. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people describe with small, comfortable words: steady, practical, quiet. I work in a role that supports other people's decisions rather than showcasing my own. One of those positions where you're trusted, relied on, and rarely asked how you're doing. If you passed me on the street, you probably wouldn't look twice. And that's exactly how most of my life has unfolded. People often mistake my calm for softness, my silence for consent, my patience for a lack of boundaries. I don't interrupt. I don't dramatize. I don't raise my voice to make a point. And because of that, many assume I don't see what's happening around me, that I miss things. I let things slide because I don't notice them. This story is not about revenge. It's not about outsmarting someone in a dramatic courtroom scene or exposing secrets in a single explosive moment. It's about realization, slow, unsettling, and irreversible. It's about what happens when you discover that the life you thought you were building was standing on paperwork, omissions, and a truth that had been carefully hidden in plain sight. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to walk you through a very specific emotional journey. It begins with trust, the ordinary, unromantic kind that grows from shared routines and quiet promises. It moves through confusion, where small inconsistencies are easy to dismiss because love teaches us to explain things away. And then it reaches clarity, not all at once, but in pieces that rearrange themselves until there's no way to pretend anymore. I want to be clear about something from the start. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't rush to confront or accuse. What happened instead was quieter and in many ways more definitive. I learned. I documented. I waited. And when I finally acted, it wasn't fueled by anger. It was guided by self-respect. If you're expecting a villain and a hero, you won't quite find them here. You'll find people making choices that felt convenient at the time. You'll find a system that assumes the quiet person will stay quiet forever. And you'll find what happens when that assumption is wrong. This is a story about marriage, yes, but more than that, it's a story about identity. About the moment you realized you were never playing the role you thought you were playing. About discovering that your loyalty was real, even if the foundation beneath it wasn't. I'm sharing this not to warn you against love and not to make you suspicious of everyone you trust. I'm sharing it because sometimes the most important turning points in our lives don't arrive with noise. They arrive with documents, dates, and the calm certainty that you finally understand what you're standing in. So before we go any further, I want to ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever looked back at a relationship and realized that the truth had been there the whole time, just waiting for you to be ready to see it? For a long time, I believed I knew exactly who I was in other people's lives. I was the dependable one, the woman you could count on to remember birthdays without reminders, to handle logistics without complaint, to smooth over awkward moments before they became conflicts. In my marriage, I was the calm one. That's what my husband used to say when friends asked how we worked so well together. "She keeps things steady," he'd say, smiling like he was paying me a compliment. And I accepted that role easily because it matched how I'd always moved through the world. At work, I was trusted with sensitive details but rarely invited into the spotlight. At family gatherings, I was the listener, the one people gravitated toward when they needed understanding rather than advice. I didn't demand attention. I didn't compete for it. I thought that made me mature. In my marriage, this translated into being the emotional infrastructure. I remembered which conversations needed to happen and which ones could wait. I noticed shifts in mood before they were acknowledged. I made space, endless flexible space, for someone else's stress, ambition, and silence. From the outside, we looked balanced. He was expressive, charming, and easy to like. I was composed, grounded, and unthreatening. People often said we fit. What they really meant was that I didn't disrupt his rhythm. What I didn't realize then was how invisible that made me. I wasn't ignored in a dramatic way. There was no cruelty, no obvious dismissal. It was subtler. Decisions were made around me instead of with me. Information arrived late, already shaped. Questions about the future were answered in generalities instead of specifics. When I asked for clarity, I was met with reassurance instead of facts. And because I didn't want to seem distrustful, I let reassurance stand in for truth. I told myself that not everything needed to be shared, that privacy was healthy, that my role wasn't to interrogate, but to support. I was proud of being low maintenance, of not needing constant validation or explanation. People praise that about me. You're so understanding. You don't overreact. You're easy to be with. Each of those comments landed like approval. And approval, when you're quiet by nature, can be addictive. It feels like proof that your restraint is virtuous rather than costly. Looking back now, I can see how clearly defined my role was, to everyone but me. I was the safe place, not the decision maker. The stabilizer, not the equal. The woman who would adjust rather than insist. Even my husband, I think, believed this was simply who I was. Not someone who demanded full transparency, not someone who would dig too deeply, not someone who would question foundational assumptions unless they were handed to her in plain language. And why would he think otherwise? I had trained everyone around me to expect very little noise from me. The strange part is that I wasn't unhappy. Not overtly. I felt useful, needed, trusted with surface-level responsibilities. I mistook proximity for inclusion and consistency for intimacy. I didn't see myself as someone being kept in the dark. I saw myself as someone mature enough not to need every light turned on. That's the danger of being perceived as steady. People assume you don't shift, that you won't, that you can absorb weight indefinitely without cracking. What no one seemed to notice was that steadiness doesn't mean blindness. Silence doesn't mean absence of awareness. And being easy to live with doesn't mean being easy to deceive. At that stage in my life, I still believed that if something truly mattered, I would be told. That love came with an unspoken guarantee of honesty. That there were certain lines people simply didn't cross when they committed to someone. I didn't yet understand that assumptions are the most convenient place for other people to hide their truths. And I certainly didn't know, couldn't have known, that the role I was playing so well depended on one very specific misunderstanding about who I was allowed to be in my own marriage. At that point, I was still the woman they thought they knew. Quiet, reliable, uncomplicated, and entirely underestimated. The first moment that unsettled me was so small that I almost forgot it happened. There was no argument, no raised voices, no confession trembling on the edge of a sentence. It was a pause, brief, almost unnoticeable, when I asked a question I thought was ordinary. We were sorting through paperwork one evening, the kind of mundane task that makes a marriage feel real. Bills, insurance statements, old folders. He said he'd been meaning to organize for years. I remember holding a document and noticing a date that didn't align with the version of his past I knew. It wasn't dramatic, just earlier than it should have been. I asked about it casually, the way you do when you assume the answer will be simple. He glanced at it, then back at me and said, "That must be an old thing. I'll check later." His tone was calm, too calm, not defensive, dismissive. That was the cut. Because what followed wasn't an explanation, but redirection. He changed the subject, asked if I'd seen the mail, made a joke about how boring paperwork was. And because I had spent years being the woman who didn't press, I let the moment pass. But something had shifted. It wasn't suspicion, not yet. It was awareness. The sense that a door had been quietly closed in a room I thought I was standing in. I told myself there were reasonable explanations. Of course there were. Lives are complicated, documents linger, dates blur. Still, I remembered that pause. Over the next few weeks, there were other moments just like it. Small, forgettable to anyone else. A hesitation before answering a question about a past address, a vague response about a previous job that didn't quite match an earlier story. Each time the inconsistency was minor enough to be dismissed on its own, and each time I did dismiss it. Not because I didn't notice, but because I didn't want to become someone who counted. I've learned since then that there's a difference between trust and avoidance. At the time, I believed I was practicing the first. When I mentioned one of these discrepancies to a close friend, she laughed gently and told me I was overthinking. "You know how messy people's pasts can be," she said. "If there was something important, you'd know." That sentence lodged itself into my thinking like a rule. If there was something important, you'd know. So I adjusted my expectations instead of my questions. I told myself that clarity would come organically, that pressing for details would only create unnecessary tension. I didn't want to become the kind of partner who interrogated the past as if it were evidence in a trial. But the problem with small cuts is that they don't hurt enough to demand attention. They sting just enough to make you more careful, more accommodating. I became gentler with my curiosity, softer in how I asked things. Eventually, I stopped asking at all. What I didn't realize was that each unanswered question wasn't disappearing, it was being stored. I remembered the dates, the wording. The way his eyes shifted was not in fear, but in calculation. I noticed how certain topics were always brushed aside with humor or fatigue, how reassurance replaced information every single time. No one else seemed concerned. His family spoke warmly of him, but carefully avoided certain periods of his life. Old friends told stories that stopped short of specifics. I assumed it was a coincidence or discretion. I still believed in the version of him I had married. I just started to see the outlines of something else beneath it, something that didn't want to be named. The first small cut didn't make me bleed. It made me pay attention. And once you start paying attention, it's impossible to go back to not seeing. After a while, the moments that once felt strange began to feel routine. Not because they made sense, but because I had learned how to live around them. The unanswered questions became part of the background noise of our marriage. I adjusted my expectations subtly without ever announcing that I was doing so. I stopped asking follow-up questions when his answers came wrapped in vagueness. I learned which topics would be met with distraction, which ones with light irritation, and which ones would simply dissolve into silence. And every time I adapted, it felt like maturity. I told myself I was choosing peace, that not every detail needed to be shared, that insisting on full transparency was unrealistic, even controlling. After all, no one is owed their partner's entire past, right? That idea is easy to accept when you're the one doing the accommodating. What I didn't name at the time was that my curiosity was being treated as an inconvenience, not openly, not cruelly, but consistently. Each time I asked something that required effort or honesty, the response subtly suggested I was asking too much. A sigh, a joke, a reminder that the past is the past. And I responded by becoming easier. I filled in gaps with generous interpretations. I explained away inconsistencies before they had a chance to settle into doubt. I told myself that love meant not keeping score, not tracking contradictions, not needing to verify. In doing so, I normalized something that should never have been normal, being gently discouraged from understanding the life I was legally and emotionally tied to. There were moments when I felt the imbalance clearly, when I realized how much of my history he knew, every address, every relationship, every mistake I'd ever made, compared to how little of his was accessible to me. But even then, I reframed it as a personality difference. He's private, I'm open. He processes internally, I talk things through. Those explanations allowed me to stay comfortable without demanding change. The truth is, disrespect doesn't always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as an inconvenience, your needs quietly framed as unnecessary effort. Your questions are treated as disruptions rather than invitations to connect. And because there was no overt conflict, no clear line being crossed, I didn't feel justified in pushing back. I was still being treated kindly, affectionately even. On the surface, nothing was wrong. But beneath that surface, a pattern had formed. He decided what was shareable. I accepted what was given. And over time, that arrangement became an unspoken law. I can see now how that dynamic served him. It required no lies in the moment, only omissions, No confrontation, only my cooperation, and I provided that cooperation willingly because I believed that being understanding made me strong. I didn't yet understand the difference between patience and erasure. By the time I noticed how often my discomfort was being minimized, I had already internalized the idea that raising concerns would make me difficult, and being seen as difficult felt like a failure of character. So I stayed quiet, I stayed kind, I stayed reasonable, and in doing so, I helped create a reality where my right to clarity was optional, and his comfort was protected at all costs. That was the stage where disrespect stopped feeling like a violation and started feeling like the price of harmony. What I didn't realize was that harmony built on silence isn't peace. It's preparation. There is a moment, quiet, almost unremarkable, when you realize you've been cast in a role you never auditioned for. For me, it came during a conversation that wasn't even about me. We were at a small gathering, nothing formal, people who knew us casually. Someone asked how we managed things so smoothly as a couple, and before I could answer, my husband did. "She's just very low drama," he said, smiling. "She doesn't get hung up on details." Everyone laughed lightly, including me. In that laugh, something settled. That was who I was to them. Not thoughtful, not discerning, just flexible, easy. Someone who wouldn't press, wouldn't challenge, wouldn't complicate. And I realized that this wasn't just how he described me, it was how I was being used. I was the reliable background presence, the woman who would keep things running, absorb tension, and never ask for more than she was given. The one who made other people feel comfortable by making herself smaller. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how decisions were presented to me as conclusions, not discussions, how plans were already formed by the time I heard about them, how my agreement was assumed before it was requested. And when I did hesitate, when I asked for clarification or time, I was met with surprise, as if I had briefly stepped out of character. That reaction told me everything. Roles are maintained not by force, but by expectation. And I had fulfilled mine so consistently that any deviation felt disruptive. What hurt wasn't that he saw me this way. It was because I had helped him do it. I had confused being accommodating with being equal. I had believed that not insisting on my full presence made me loving. In reality, it had made me convenient. Still, I didn't confront him. Not because I was afraid, but because something inside me had shifted from emotion to observation. I wasn't ready to speak. I was ready to understand. I started noticing how often my steadiness was used as justification. "She'll be fine with it. She doesn't mind. She understands." Those phrases followed me like shadows. They were never confirmed, just assumed. And in those assumptions, I recognized the danger. Because when someone believes you will always adapt, they stop considering whether they should. That was when I understood the full shape of the role I had been assigned: supportive, silent, stable, and ultimately expendable. Not in a dramatic sense, but in the way you replace a foundation only after you've finished building on top of it. That realization didn't break me. It clarified me. I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. The kind that forms when you step back and see a pattern instead of individual moments. When you stop taking things personally and start seeing them structurally. And in that distance, a new question formed. If this is who they think I am, what happens when I stop performing it? The shift didn't happen during a fight. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in an ordinary room, while nothing was technically wrong. I was alone, looking for a document I needed for something unrelated. Taxes, I think. One of those tasks that requires you to open folders you rarely touch. I wasn't searching for answers. I wasn't suspicious. I was just being practical. That's when I found it. A document filed under an outdated category, saved with a name that didn't draw attention to itself. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't locked. It was simply there, waiting. I remember staring at the screen, not fully understanding what I was seeing at first. My mind tried to contextualize it gently, the way it always had. This must be old. This probably doesn't mean what it looks like. But the details didn't allow for that comfort. Names, dates, a legal designation that didn't align with the story I had been told about his past, about when things ended, about what had been resolved before we met. I didn't panic. That's the part that surprises people when I tell them this. I felt still, very still, as if something inside me had finally settled into place. The unease I'd been carrying without naming it suddenly had a shape. And once something has a shape, you can't pretend it's nothing. I closed the file. Not because I was in denial, but because I understood instinctively that reacting immediately would cost me clarity. That was the moment silence became intentional. I didn't confront him that day, or the next. I didn't ask questions I already knew the answers to. I didn't let my voice betray what my mind was organizing. Instead, I observed. I watched how easily he moved through our shared life, unaware that the ground had shifted beneath him. I noticed how comfortable he was with the assumption that I remained exactly who I had always been. And I realized something else, something crucial. This wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a legal one, a structural one, a reality that extended far beyond emotion. That understanding changed everything. I wasn't dealing with heartbreak, I was dealing with facts. And facts don't require confrontation, they require verification. So I waited, not passively, precisely. I began to review what I had access to: accounts, records, timelines. I didn't dig recklessly. I moved slowly, carefully, making sure I understood what I was seeing before drawing conclusions. There was no rush. The truth wasn't going anywhere. Each piece of information confirmed what the document had suggested. The story I'd been told wasn't incomplete. It was inaccurate, not by accident, but by design. And in that realization, something inside me hardened, not into anger, but into resolve. I knew then that whatever came next couldn't be emotional. It had to be exact. That day didn't end with a confrontation. It ended with a decision I didn't yet fully articulate but deeply understood. I would not reveal what I knew until I knew everything. Silence feels different when it's no longer a habit, but a decision. Before, my quiet had been automatic, an instinct shaped by years of being agreeable, adaptable, unobtrusive. Now, it was deliberate, measured, almost surgical. Nothing about my behavior changed on the surface. I still asked how his day was, still made dinner, still listened when he talked about work or complained about minor inconveniences. If anything, I became easier to live with. That was the irony. People often imagine that when someone learns a devastating truth, their behavior shifts dramatically. They become distant, emotional, erratic, but I did the opposite. I became composed in a way that unsettled even me. Because silence, when chosen, creates space. And in that space, other people reveal themselves. I noticed how little effort it took for him to maintain the illusion of normalcy. He didn't sense danger because I didn't introduce any. He continued to speak freely, to contradict himself in small ways, to reference timelines that no longer aligned with the facts I was quietly collecting. He mistook my calm for ignorance. That miscalculation gave me clarity. I started keeping notes, not emotional ones, but factual. Dates, statements, documents. I didn't search obsessively. I searched methodically, always with the same rule: never assume, always confirm. What surprised me most was how much information was accessible once I stopped needing permission to understand it. The truth had never been buried. It had simply been placed where no one expected me to look, because no one believed I would. My silence gave him confidence. Confidence made him careless. And I learned how powerful it is to let someone believe they are unchallenged. At times, I felt the urge to speak, to ask why, to demand how, to confront the unfairness of it all. But I resisted that urge not out of fear, but out of strategy. Emotion would only give him time to adapt. Clarity gave me leverage. I also began to understand how deeply he relied on my predictability. I was the constant in his life, the one thing he never questioned. And because of that, he never prepared for the possibility that I might be paying attention in a way I hadn't before. That realization wasn't empowering in a triumphant sense. It was sobering. It made me see how easily trust can be mistaken for permanence. I didn't feel superior. I felt awake. Silence, I learned, isn't weakness when it's informed. It's restraint. And restraint creates asymmetry, especially when the other person believes they hold all the information. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't rehearsing speeches. I was simply allowing the truth to finish assembling itself. Because once you choose silence consciously, you control when and how it ends. What they never noticed was how observant I'd always been. They assumed my quiet meant I wasn't tracking details, that my calm meant I didn't remember inconsistencies. That's because I didn't react. I didn't register. In reality, silence had given me years of practice watching without being seen. Now I use that skill deliberately. I began to map his story the way you would map a city you thought you knew, street by street, date by date. I compared what he had told me with what the documents recorded. I cross-referenced timelines not out of obsession, but out of respect for accuracy. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped explaining them away. Addresses overlapped. Dates didn't end when they were supposed to. Legal terms appeared in places where they had no business being, unless the past wasn't as finished as I'd been led to believe. Still, I moved carefully. I didn't take shortcuts. I didn't jump to conclusions. Every discovery was verified twice, sometimes 3 times. Because when you're quiet, people expect you to be wrong. I wasn't going to give anyone that excuse. What struck me most during that time wasn't the betrayal itself, but how much effort had gone into assuming I would never look closely. The system worked because it relied on my compliance, not his perfection. And I had been very compliant. I also started paying attention to how others interacted with him when I wasn't the focus. The pauses in conversation, the way certain names were avoided, the polite deflections when past events came up. It wasn't a conspiracy, it was coordination through omission. Everyone knew just enough to stay comfortable. Everyone assumed I knew too. That was the most isolating realization of all. In the midst of this, I didn't withdraw from my life. I didn't collapse into secrecy. I functioned normally because I understood that maintaining normalcy was part of the work. Stability kept me invisible. Invisibility kept me informed. I consulted professionals, not dramatically, not with accusations, but with neutral questions framed around hypotheticals. I asked what certain documents meant, what certain timelines implied, what certain situations could legally indicate. Each answer sharpened the picture, and slowly, unmistakably, the truth came into focus. I wasn't uncovering an affair. I wasn't discovering a hidden relationship. I was learning that the foundation of my marriage had been legally compromised from the start. That knowledge didn't explode inside me. It settled. Because once something is undeniable, it no longer needs emotion to validate it. They never noticed how much I was learning, how prepared I was becoming, how the woman they believed would never challenge the structure of things was quietly understanding it better than they ever had. They never noticed because they never believed they had to. And that was their final miscalculation. The moment of full clarity didn't come with shock. It came with confirmation. By the time I reached it, I already knew what I was going to find. I just needed the last piece to remove all doubt, the kind of doubt that keeps you emotionally tethered even when logic has already let go. I sat alone when I reviewed it. No music, no distractions, just me, a screen, and a set of facts that finally aligned too cleanly to argue with. He had never divorced her, not before we met, not before we married, not after. The marriage I believed was long dissolved still existed. Quietly, legally, undeniably. The timelines overlapped in a way that made my chest feel hollow rather than tight. There was no dramatic realization, just a deep, grounding certainty. I wasn't the second love. I was the second wife. That distinction matters more than people realize. Being deceived emotionally is devastating, but it leaves room for interpretation, intent, confusion, weakness. Being deceived legally removes all ambiguity. Documents don't misunderstand. Systems don't forget. They either reflect reality or they don't. And these did. I didn't cry when I saw it. I didn't feel rage. I felt something closer to detachment, the kind that comes when your body understands before your heart catches up. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time, letting the meaning of it settle without rushing to give it emotion. I understood that whatever grief would come later deserved honesty, not theatrics. This wasn't a scandal. It was a structure, and I was standing outside of it now, seeing it clearly for the first time. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. Not because I was unaffected, but because the uncertainty was gone. The low-level anxiety I'd carried for years without naming it finally had an explanation. Nothing was wrong with my intuition. Nothing was wrong with my memory. Nothing was wrong with my expectations. I had been responding appropriately to incomplete information. That realization restored something fundamental in me. I didn't tell anyone. Not a friend, not a family member. This wasn't a secret I needed validated. It was a truth I needed to decide how to handle. I thought about what confrontation would give me. Temporary relief, emotional release, and immediate resistance. I thought about what patience could give me. Options. So I chose patience. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I respected myself enough to proceed with precision. I had spent years being underestimated. I wasn't going to announce that I was no longer willing to be. The private reveal didn't make me powerful. It made it clear. And clarity, I learned, is the most stable form of control. Once the truth was complete, the noise inside me disappeared. What replaced it wasn't certainty about what I wanted to do, but clarity about what I could do. And those are very different things. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one evening, not thinking emotionally, but structurally, like someone standing at a crossroads with a map instead of a pulse. Every option was visible now, laid out without distortion. I could confront him immediately. Ask for explanations I already knew wouldn't be honest. Demand accountability in a conversation he would try to soften, redirect, or delay. That path led to chaos and to him having time to prepare. I could tell my family, friends, blow the truth open and let collective outrage do the work for me. But that would turn my life into a spectacle, and I would lose control of the narrative before I even understood its full implications. Or I could do nothing. Stay silent indefinitely. Let the truth sit between us like a loaded object no one acknowledged. That option would protect stability, but at the cost of my own integrity. Then there was the option no one ever imagines the quiet person choosing. I could move first. Not emotionally, not loudly, but decisively. That option required patience, planning, and the willingness to accept that once I began, there would be no undoing it. No half measures. No, let's talk this through. It meant accepting that the life I had been living was already over. I just hadn't announced it yet. That was the hardest realization of all, because endings are easier when they feel mutual. This one wouldn't. This one would arrive without warning for him, and with full awareness for me. I sat with that weight for days, not because I doubted the truth, but because I respected the permanence of action. I understood that whatever choice I made would redefine how I saw myself forever, and I didn't want to become someone reactive. In the end, the deciding factor wasn't anger or fear, it was alignment. I asked myself one question: which option allows me to remain precise, lawful, and intact without negotiating with a lie? Only one answer fits. I chose the irreversible path. Not because I wanted to punish him, not because I wanted control, but because once you see a structure clearly, the only ethical move is to step out of it completely. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't mark it with ceremony. I simply began. That was the moment my life split into two timelines, the one he still believed we were in, and the one I had already left. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not in a paralyzing way, but in a deliberate one. I understood that moving too quickly would attract attention, and attention would invite interference. So I let time stretch. I let routines remain intact. I let him believe that nothing had changed. From the outside, our lives looked exactly the same. Inside, it was already dismantling. I started with a separation that didn't look like a separation. I organized my personal documents, secured copies of everything that mattered. I created boundaries in places no one ever thinks to look: administrative, financial, procedural. None of it was dramatic. That was the point. I redirected my income quietly. I clarified ownership. I made sure my name was attached only to what it should be attached to, and detached from what it should never have been connected to in the first place. Every step was lawful. Every move was documented. Precision mattered more than speed. He didn't notice. Why would he? I was still present, still calm, still predictable. People underestimate how invisible preparation can be when it doesn't come with emotional signals. I wasn't angry. I wasn't distant. I wasn't acting like someone planning an exit. I was acting like someone at peace. That made me unremarkable. I also began to prepare psychologically, not for confrontation, but for consequence. I practiced neutrality. I rehearsed speaking without explaining. I imagined questions without answers attached to them. Not because I wanted to be cold, but because clarity doesn't require performance. The hardest part was restraint. There were moments when he spoke about the future casually, plans, trips, ideas that assumed permanence. I listened without correcting him. Not because I agreed, but because I understood that the future he was imagining no longer included me. And he didn't need to know that yet. What mattered was that when the shift finally occurred, it would not depend on his cooperation. It would already be complete. That's the quiet power of moving in silence. You don't argue with someone about a door you've already closed. You don't negotiate with someone who no longer has access. By the time anything outwardly changed, my inner life was already reorganized. My sense of self was no longer anchored to the marriage, the role, or the illusion of partnership. I wasn't disappearing. I was detaching cleanly, methodically, without noise. And still no one noticed. Not him, not his family, not the people who thought they knew me best. Because silence, when misunderstood, looks exactly like compliance. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They arrive as absences. The first thing he noticed wasn't conflict. It was inconvenience. Small disruptions he couldn't quite explain. A delay here, a complication there. Systems that used to function smoothly suddenly required effort. He assumed it was stress, work, timing. He never assumed it was me. That's what happens when someone believes your role is permanent. They don't imagine you as the source of change. They imagine the world misbehaving. I watched this shift with a calm detachment that surprised even me. Not because I lacked feeling, but because I had already processed the truth privately. By the time consequences began to surface, I wasn't reacting. I was observing outcomes. There were moments when he seemed unsettled, not panicked, just off balance. Plans required more coordination. Certain assurances no longer held. Things he had once delegated to me without thinking now required his attention. And he didn't like that. Still, he didn't ask questions. He complained instead about inefficiency, about how things felt more complicated lately. He spoke as if the system itself had changed, never considering that the person maintaining it had quietly stepped back. I said very little, not out of spite, but out of alignment. I was no longer filling gaps that weren't mine to fill. I wasn't smoothing over the friction that revealed the truth. I allowed natural consequences to exist without interference. That alone changed the balance. Other people began to feel it too. Subtle shifts in availability, in responsiveness, in emotional labor. I hadn't withdrawn abruptly. I had simply stopped compensating. And when compensation ends, reality shows up. Confusion replaced confidence, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the invisible support had been removed. The ease they had grown accustomed to no longer came automatically. Still, no one connected the dots. They asked if I was tired, if work was stressful, if everything was okay. I answered honestly, but briefly. Yes, it's fine. I'm handling it. Those answers weren't lies. They just didn't include explanations. What struck me during that period was how uncomfortable people became when the quiet person stopped over-functioning. Not angry, just uncertain, as if something essential had gone missing and they didn't know how to replace it. That discomfort was not my responsibility. I had spent years maintaining stability that wasn't reciprocated. Now I allowed imbalance to reveal itself without correction. And that's when the consequences truly began. Not as punishment, but as exposure. Because when you remove silence as a cushion, the truth has nowhere to land but directly. By the time panic appeared, the structure was already compromised. It didn't arrive as an urgency at first. It arrived as irritation, questions framed as complaints, concerns disguised as jokes. He began to notice that things no longer resolved themselves. Those explanations no longer smoothed over complications, that the ground beneath his assumptions felt unstable. He started asking more questions, not the right ones, but more of them. Have you noticed things being off lately? Did something change with this? Why does this feel harder than it used to? Each question circled the truth without approaching it. He sensed loss, but couldn't locate the source. And because he had never believed I was central to the system, he never considered that I had quietly stepped out of it. That's when the anxiety crept in. I saw it in the way he checked his phone more often, in the way his voice tightened when discussing logistics that once came easily, in how he began to reassert control in small ways, offering suggestions, giving instructions, trying to reestablish the rhythm he was used to. But rhythms don't return once the foundation is gone. He tried to fix things through effort instead of understanding, through activity instead of accountability. He didn't realize that nothing he was addressing was the real problem. Because the real problem wasn't operational, it was structural. At one point, he suggested we talk things through, not because he knew what was wrong, but because he felt the distance and wanted reassurance. He wanted confirmation that the role I had played for years was still available. I listened, and for the first time, I didn't feel the silence. I let his words sit where they landed. I didn't rush to comfort. I didn't clarify. I didn't soften the moment by making myself smaller. That was when fear finally appeared in his eyes. Not fear of losing me emotionally, but fear of not understanding what was happening. People often assume panic comes from guilt. Sometimes it comes from losing control. By then, it was too late to fix anything, not because I was unwilling to listen, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. The truth wasn't something we could process together. It was something he had chosen to live around without my consent. He was searching for a reset. I was already finished. And the most difficult thing for him to accept wasn't that I knew, it was that I no longer needed explanations. Because once clarity replaces confusion, reassurance loses its power. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost quiet enough to miss. There was no dramatic setup, no raised voices, no moment where I announced that I knew everything. It took place on an evening that looked ordinary from the outside. Dinner finished, dishes drying, the day winding down like it always had. He spoke first, not with an accusation, but with uncertainty. He said he felt a distance he couldn't explain, that something had shifted, that I seemed different. I nodded. That was all. The pause that followed unsettled him more than any reaction could have. He waited for reassurance, for correction, for me to resume the familiar role of stabilizer. When I didn't, he tried again, asking if I was unhappy, if I was overwhelmed, if there was something he could fix. That's when I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I didn't ask questions that invited denial. I stated facts, carefully, minimally, without commentary. I told him I knew he had never divorced his first wife. I told him I had verified it. I told him that meant our marriage was never legally valid. I stopped there. Silence filled the room, heavy but contained. His reaction wasn't explosive. It was fragmented. Confusion first, then denial, then an unconvincing, then a rush of explanations that contradicted each other in their urgency. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I said one sentence. I'm not here to debate what you intended. I'm here to acknowledge what exists. That was the moment he understood something irreversible had occurred. He tried to pivot to emotion, to history, to the life we had shared. He spoke about love, about how complicated things had been, about how he never meant to hurt me. I listened, not coldly, but without engagement. Intent didn't change the structure. Affection didn't undo legality. Apologies didn't restore consent. What surprised him most was my lack of visible anger. He kept searching my face for it, as if anger would make this familiar, manageable. But there was none, only certainty. I told him I had already taken steps to separate myself from the situation, that I wasn't asking for permission or agreement. I wanted the process from that point forward to remain calm and formal. He asked if there was any way to work through it. I answered honestly, no. Not harshly, not dramatically, just clearly. Because confrontation doesn't require heat when the truth is complete. It doesn't need performance when the decision has already been made. That night ended without resolution in the way people expect. But for me, it was finished. Not because he accepted it, but because I no longer needed him to. After everything ended, there was a long stretch of time where nothing dramatic happened. No reinvention montage, no sudden declarations, no urgent need to prove that I was okay. What I felt instead was space. Not the empty kind, the kind that echoes, but a clean, quiet space where my thoughts could finally move without navigating around someone else's omissions. For years, my inner life had been arranged to accommodate uncertainty. Now that uncertainty was gone, and the silence it left behind was strangely generous, I didn't rush to tell my story. Some people knew pieces. Others sensed a shift and asked careful questions. I answered only what felt necessary. I had spent too long explaining myself to people who benefited from not understanding me. I wasn't going to continue that pattern in the aftermath. What surprised me most was how little I missed the version of myself I had been in that marriage. Not because she was weak. She wasn't. She was loyal, patient, and capable of enormous emotional labor, but she was oriented outward. Her sense of responsibility extended beyond herself in ways that were never reciprocated. I didn't want to become someone else. I wanted to become aligned. I am still calm, still measured, still someone who listens more than she speaks. Those traits were never the problem. What changed was how I deploy them. Before, my calm was available to anyone who needed it. Now it's selective. Before, my patience was endless. Now it has criteria. Before, my silence was assumed. Now it is intentional and temporary. I don't disappear inside relationships anymore. I don't let my steadiness become a tool others use to avoid accountability. If something matters, I ask about it directly. If an answer is vague, I notice. If clarity is withheld, I don't compensate for it. That doesn't make me harsh. It makes me present. One of the quiet lessons I took with me is that honesty is not just about telling the truth. It's about allowing yourself to require it. For a long time, I believed that asking for clarity was intrusive, that insisting on full information was unkind. Now I understand that withholding the truth is the real intrusion. It places someone in a reality they didn't consent to navigate. I also stopped romanticizing endurance. There's a cultural narrative, especially around women, that celebrates how much we can absorb. How much can you tolerate? How long can you stay composed while carrying other people's chaos? I no longer confuse that capacity with virtue. Endurance is only admirable when it serves a future that is honest. Otherwise, it's just slow self-erasure. These days, my life is quieter, in visible ways. Smaller social circles, fewer obligations, more intentional routines. I protect my mornings, I protect my energy, I protect my name, legally, emotionally, structurally. That last one matters more than people realize. What happened to me wasn't just personal, it was systemic. It taught me how fragile identity can be when it's built on assumptions instead of verification. I no longer assume goodwill replaces responsibility. I no longer believe love excuses illegality or that intimacy absolves deception. And yet I am not cynical. That's important to say. I still believe in partnership. I still believe in trust. I still believe in love that is chosen daily, not maintained through silence. What I no longer believe in is the idea that being easy is the same as being valued. If someone describes me now as low drama, it's because I don't stay in situations that require drama to function. If they say I'm calm, it's because I don't ignore my instincts anymore. Calm, I've learned, isn't the absence of conflict. It's the absence of self-betrayal. I don't feel bitterness toward him. That often confuses people. They expect anger to linger, to sharpen over time. But anger requires ongoing engagement, and I disengaged fully. I understand what he did, not in a forgiving way, in a factual way. I understand the convenience of omission, the comfort of assuming someone else will adapt, the ease of building a life on the belief that the quiet person will never check the foundation. Understanding doesn't mean excusing. It means I don't need to carry the story forward with me. The most profound change is internal. I trust myself now without needing confirmation. I trust my memory, my intuition, my ability to notice when something doesn't align, even if it can't yet be proven. I no longer override that signal for the sake of harmony. Harmony that requires self-denial is not harmony, it's compliance. There is a particular kind of dignity that comes from leaving quietly but completely, from not needing applause, from not requiring the other person to fully understand what they lost. I didn't leave to teach a lesson. I left because I had learned one. And the woman I am now doesn't need to be louder, colder, or harder to protect herself. She simply needs to remain precise. Precision in what she accepts, precision in what she asks for, precision in when she stays and when she goes. That precision is not fear-based, it's freedom-based. I live with fewer assumptions now. About people, about roles, about what is normal. I read documents, I ask follow-up questions, I don't mistake reassurance for truth. And when something feels off, I don't rush to fix the feeling. I investigate the cause. That, more than anything, is who I am now. Not someone defined by what happened to her, but someone shaped by how clearly she chose to see it and how quietly she chose herself afterward. There are stories that end with justice delivered loudly, through exposure, punishment, or public reckoning. This isn't one of them. What happened to me didn't resolve through humiliation or spectacle. It was resolved through alignment, through the quiet, sometimes uncomfortable act of choosing reality over reassurance. For a long time, I thought the most painful part of my story was the discovery itself, that moment of learning I wasn't the second love, but the second wife. That my marriage had been standing on a legal fiction I never consented to participate in. But that wasn't the deepest wound. The deepest wound was realizing how easily I had been positioned to absorb uncertainty without questioning it. How my calm had been mistaken for consent, how my patience had been used as cover, and how close I came to believing that was just the cost of being easy to love. The moral of this story isn't be suspicious, it's precise. Precision is asking for clarity without apologizing. Precision is noticing when answers soothe instead of inform. Precision is understanding that love does not require you to live inside someone else's omissions. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after listening to this, it's this. Being quiet does not obligate you to be compliant. Being kind does not require you to stay confused. And being patient does not mean you owe anyone unlimited access to your life. I didn't leave because I stopped loving. I left because I started respecting the structure of truth. Some people will hear this story and focus on him, on how someone could live that way, justify that kind of deception, build a future on an unresolved past. That curiosity is natural. But the more important focus, I think, is on the system that allowed it to continue. The assumptions, the silence, the belief that the quiet person will never check the foundation. Because those systems exist everywhere. In relationships, in workplaces, in families. In friendships where one person does the emotional labor while another takes the credit. The question isn't how this happened. The question is, where am I being asked to accept reassurance instead of truth? You don't need proof to honor your intuition. You don't need permission to ask questions. And you don't need drama to leave a situation that requires you to disappear to maintain peace. Sometimes, the most powerful form of justice is simply refusing to participate any longer. Not loudly, not bitterly, just completely. If you've ever been the steady one, the reliable one, the one who keeps things functioning while others move freely, I see you. And if this story stirred something uncomfortable or familiar in you, that doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're paying attention. So I'll leave you with this question, and I genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized that your silence was being mistaken for consent? And what did you do when you finally saw it?